health equity needs to be part of this conversation. Canada is an enormous country, and we have people living in rural and remote areas that won't have easy access to some of these new therapies, and we need to figure that out somehow, some way. These therapies might not be available even in every province and territory.
Hi, I'm Costas.
And I'm Lester. Welcome to another episode of What's with RWE. And today we actually have a very special segment. Instead of one guest, we actually have two guests on today. We have the lovely Sang-Mi Lee and also Brian O'Rourke on with us today. So Sang-Mi is from Morse Consulting. She has been a very passionate healthcare leader and pharmacist with global executive MBA in healthcare and life sciences. She has over 20 years of unique healthcare experience from both public, private sector, consulting, and non-for-profit. And right now she is, of course, again, is the director of innovative access solutions at Morse Consulting. Prior to that, she was the senior manager and senior pharmacist at the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, or PCPA, which we'll hear a lot about today. So there's going to be a lot of acronyms being thrown out today. And then on the other side, we have Brian O'Rourke. Brian is the president of Brian O'Rourke Healthcare Consulting, based in Ottawa, Ontario. He is currently the president of ISPOR, and prior to his retirement that he'll probably talk a little bit to us about, he was actually president and chief executive of the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies and Health. So that's CADTH from 2009 all the way to 2020. So both of you, welcome to the show. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
My pleasure.
So maybe we can just start off with talking a little bit about your journey and how you got from maybe where you started to, today where you are right now from a career perspective in market access. So this is something that is very curious for us, primarily because this is a very niche area, let's say. So how did you come down this path? So maybe let's start with Sang-Mi. Maybe you can lead us off here.
Sure. So I am a pharmacist by training, right? And, when I started working as a pharmacist, I kind of thought, I really wanted to understand how to make a sort of a more, population impact, right, around drug reimbursement, appropriate use, and funding. And so I actually had an opportunity to work in the government, Ontario Public Drug Programs, while I was a student. And I just thought that, I wanted to go down that road while still practicing a bit as a frontline healthcare pharmacist, to have that sort of policy impact, but also just impact on how do you really think about appropriate use of medication, appropriate criteria, how to look at the utilization of drugs, to best serve the public and sort of ensure that the taxpayers' money are going to really serve, the right drug at the right patient for the right time. So that's kind of how I started the journey into a very different sort of pathway versus being the sort of the frontline healthcare professional. That was sort of, at the very start of my career.
Great. And Brian, yourself?
Well, I'm much older than Sang-Mi, so my history could probably take up the entire show. So I'll try and be as brief as I can. I'm also a pharmacist by training. I was trained as a pharmacist at Dalhousie University, graduating in 1980, believe it or not, before many of you were even born. Most of my career as a pharmacist was in the Canadian military. I joined the military to go through university. I spent time working in healthcare clinics, in military hospitals. I got involved with medical logistics, purchasing pharmaceuticals and medical equipment, medical supplies. As I progressed in rank, I became involved with more operational aspects of healthcare in different parts of the world where the Canadian military was operating. I was also involved with managing our healthcare system, again, for military patients. I did go back later on in my military career to do my Doctor of Pharmacy degree from the University of Toronto. Very interested in the clinical aspects of pharmacy. and that still was my passion when I graduated. But we also were exposed, and this was in the mid 90s when I did my PharmD, this burgeoning field of cost effectiveness analysis kind of piqued my interest. So when I did leave the military to join CADIF, I just thought it was a natural progression with my background in pharmacy, my knowledge of medical logistics, of management and leadership, and with this role that I was learning on health technology assessment and cost effectiveness analysis. So I spent 11 years at CADIF, first as the vice president of the Common Drug Review. That lasted for about a year. And then I was promoted to the president and chief executive officer role. And I just became very passionate about health technology assessment, access, patient involvement in the work we do, how we compare with agencies and governments around the world. And when I retired in 2020 from CADIF, I still remain involved in that global sphere of health technology assessment through my work with ISPOR, through the work that I do with the Center for Innovation and Regulatory Sciences. I chair their HTA steering committee, and all kinds of other things that I'm involved with. So that's my career in a nutshell. And mostly now, the first thing that goes into my calendar are my golf dates, and then I fill in my calendar with all of my other volunteer and consulting work after that.
No, I actually didn't know that about yourself, Brian. That you're a military man. That's I can see it from the haircut. That completely makes sense actually now. But actually, so that's interesting. Curious. I actually didn't. It should have clicked for me earlier on. But both of you actually came from a pharmacy background, and both of you actually worked as pharmacists to begin with. Okay.
Well, I was, at the Pan Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance office, sort of helping with the drug negotiations, right, between the public payers and the manufacturers. Really, we were the utilizers of the reviews and the recommendation that was coming out of CADIF, where Brian was at. So we actually did interact quite a bit professionally in those roles.
And it's interesting that I think if you talk to a lot of pharmacists, is that we are very passionate about that clinical role we play, supporting patients, et cetera. And many pharmacists also want to get involved with broader leadership and management of pharmaceuticals in Canada and globally. So, and I think that's a common trend amongst pharmacists.
Great, great. Well, that's actually a common thread. I actually wasn't aware of that. So thank you very much for that. And since actually we brought both of you on because there's a sort of a hot, maybe a relative term, definitely from an RWE standpoint, hot. This is definitely a hot topic in the last maybe couple of months. Is that the Canadian, basically, Health Canada is trying to form the Canadian Drug Agency, or the CDA. And the reason why, of course, we brought up both me and Brian is because of their background in this area. Basically, two insiders that know this probably better than anyone else, if we could say. Brian, when you were leading CADIF, and I assume you actually had a role to play in evolving CADIF towards this the CDA. What were some of the reasons for that evolution? Why did you think CADIF needed to evolve into something like the CDA? I know that they're still up in the air in terms of it's not exactly clear what the remit of CDA will be, but when you were conceiving this idea with your team, what was the reason behind that?
Yeah, so just let me put a couple of corrections in there. I would say that, yes, I have good historical knowledge of the creation of the Canadian Drug Agency and pharmaceutical management in Canada. However, the true experts today are the people that are running CADIF and working in Health Canada, working in the drug plans across the country. So I'm giving you my opinion on how things have unfolded since my time at CADIF. And I was not the person who said we needed to create a Canadian Drug Agency. There was actually the government at the time, the federal government, put together the advisory committee on the implementation of national pharmacare, led by Eric Hoskins, a former health minister in the province of Ontario. And they released their report in June of 2019. And one of their key recommendations was that we needed to create this Canadian Drug Agency. And I think the background of the history to that is Healthcare and pharmacare in Canada is extremely complicated. It's very fragmented. And is there a way that we could perhaps make it better for patients and clinicians and more efficient for taxpayers? And I think that, to me, that is what led to the most recent announcement by the federal government on the creation of the Canadian Drug Agency. And I was extremely pleased that they announced that CADTH was to become that Canadian Drug Agency.
Absolutely. And, it's funny, off air, we were just talking before we got on about the constant evolving landscape of health technology assessment, not only here in Canada, but worldwide. And oftentimes behind the scenes, you really don't understand what's the rationale that pushes it. But when you start trying to think of how do you implement a national pharmacare strategy across multiple jurisdictions, and it's not just federal, provincial, here it starts to sort of illuminate the complexities that need to be addressed. So having a single agency like the CDA, it starts to make sense in that light. But I guess one of the questions that comes to mind is, couldn't CADTH do it? What is it beyond the current remit that now needs to be layered on top or be added to really make something like national pharmacare a reality? What are the key issues that still need to be addressed by a CDA going forward for us to be able to successfully implement something like that?
Sammy, why don't you start, and then I'll jump in.
I think if you look at sort of the current discussions around sort of mandates of what CDA is going to be, it has a lot to do with data, right? It has a lot to do with increasing pan-Canadian data collection and expanding access to the drug and treatment data. And that's really important because if you think about Canada, and again, like you're talking about national pharmacare, which we don't have. And the reason why we have that discussion is because Canada has very fragmented drug insurance or drug coverage, right? And so every province has its own drug programs, but then also quite a lot of us are covered by private payers. And there's a myriad of different types of coverage plans, right, with the private payers. So data around, how a drug is utilized, how it's prescribed, and just even understanding, after the drug is even covered by insurers or drug programs, how that sort of utilization looks like, and is it appropriate, is it not? All of those kind of information is very hard to access, sort of at a national level, right? And so I think that's one of the key in terms of CDA sort of remit is like you want to be able to have a much better understanding of data, right? And that will actually help inform not just sort of safe and effective use and appropriate use of drugs, but going back to my former life at the PCPA, right? You can then have better sort of understanding of the data and the infrastructure that can be used to potentially think about pricing or negotiation based on performance or outcomes. And you could potentially have a system where, we are going to be able to do a little bit more of paying for an actual sort of, clinical outcomes or performance and that kind of thing, right? So for me, I think it is, I love the fact that I'm seeing that there is a more push towards that collection and utilization of real world evidence.
Yeah, and just to go back to your question, Costas, about what does the Canadian Drug Agency need to do, I think we need to take that up a level first, is what is the Canadian government on behalf of the people of Canada need to do? Number one, they need to make a decision. Is this going to be a single payer, public, first dollar coverage type of a pharmacare program? Or is it a program that's going to fill the gaps and ensure that every Canadian has adequate access to pharmaceuticals without undue financial risks? So to me, that is probably the most important aspect that our government still needs to make. And then the Canadian Drug Agency will roll out the programs to help manage that system, whatever that system needs to be, as well as all of the provincial governments, the health ministries, and pharmacy drug plan officials across the country. The CDA will be managed by both the federal, provincial, and territorial governments. There'll be a board of directors, all kinds of things that they'll be asked to do. Probably one of the first things, and they've already started doing that, is to help develop some form of a national formulary of drugs that all provinces will buy into, whether that's through an essential medicines list or a tiered formulary aspect. Those are some of the things that I think the CDA under Suzanne McGurn's leadership will continue to seek that direction both from her board and from the various levels of government. And to bring it back to the RWE, I think this will also give CADTH the opportunity to continue to roll out and expand their post-market drug evaluation program that Terry Ahuja has been pushing forward.
Yeah, and we're part of that program through the CoLab group as well. So we've seen it firsthand, and I think Sang-Mi, to your point, that ability to have line of sight to the actual utilization as opposed to seeing a fraction of the utilization here or utilization in certain populations but not in others, it certainly would change fundamentally the landscape of what type of negotiations or what type of contracts could be put into place, and certainly the pricing discussion would also change. But I think then that also begs the question: what is the role of some of the other groups, or will the CDA sort of subsume some of the other sort of groups that are out there? I'm thinking PCPA. Obviously, if you're at the point where you're making recommendations and you have line of sight to all of the data, do you just fold that in? And even I'll throw it out controversially, even the PMPRB, which is moving in its latest recommendations to something that looks a little bit like the PCPA / CADTH as it stands today. So with all these sort of overlapping bodies, does this become the opportunity to sort of fundamentally remake the drug approval and market access landscape in Canada?
Because there's so many acronyms that Costa just threw out there at like simultaneously. So let's assume there's billions of people watching this right now, and they're not familiar with the Canadian market access process, let's say, right? Sang-Mi, could you first maybe walk us through what that process is at the highest level possible? Maybe not in the nitty gritty yet, but if you can kind of expand that, and then that'll be helpful. Thank you.
So yeah, that's a great point. So I mean, Health Canada, right, approves a drug based on, is it safe, right? And is it sort of, does it say what it does? Is it more efficacious than a placebo or another standard of care? But just because something is approved in Canada doesn't actually mean that patients can have their insurers pay for it or drug programs will pay for it. And that's where CADTH. And actually, we should also point out that CADTH actually does serve all of the provinces and territories but Quebec. And we do have INESS, who is the sort of the health technology assessment agency for Quebec, right? So we do have two HTA agencies in Canada. And in terms of PMPRB, it's Patented Medicines Price Review Board, and they actually deal with sort of the list prices and what is a fair price in Canada. And they compare it to a lot of other countries. And there is some, I guess, many years of potential, debated changes there. I don't think I should get into that right now, but we do have, and they look at sort of the public posted prices, but a lot of both public and private drug plans don't actually pay those prices. They're confidential prices that are negotiated by the drug programs across Canada through an alliance called Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance. But then there's also, as I said, private payers who also negotiate confidential prices, right? So again, very complicated. There's many different prices for a particular drug, right? And I think really sort of going back to Costa's question, as CDA evolves, will they actually also better potentially collaborate with and work with other parts of the system that's looking at the drug prices and utilization? I really do hope so. I mean, for example, it's called Canadian Drug Agency. So I really do hope that there is a lot of synergies and collaboration with INESS and Quebec, because I think that's quite important as a Canadian drug agency. I don't know what that looks like yet, but I do think that that's probable. And then there's also that idea of, okay, so PCPA, in terms of negotiating in Canada right now, CADIT has always been a little bit sort of like they don't know the real prices. They kind of run their recommendation, and the PCP and the jurisdictions have to kind of act on it, and they do their negotiations are very apart from HTAs. But in other countries like UK and Australia, there's a lot more collaboration between the HTA and sort of the ministry or government that is negotiating. So those models are possible. And maybe, evolution of CDA involves something like that. But like I said, I'm not going to comment on PMPRB. I feel like that's probably also beyond my expertise.
So I'd love to pick up on this too. I think Sangmi did a wonderful job explaining how the Canadian healthcare system and pharmaceutical system works in Canada. There's a lot of politics involved, of course, with our constitution and some of the issues between the federal government versus the province and territories, Quebec, etc. So we won't get into those aspects. We'll leave that to the politicians and the senior officials to help manage that. But if you look back to the report that Eric Hoskins released in June of 2019, two of the most important recommendations that came out of that report was, number one, create a universal single-payer public system of drug coverage and create a Canadian drug agency. And they went on to expand that by saying that could be formed by taking components or all of various agencies. It could be portions of Health Canada. It could be portions of CADIT, PCPA, PMPRB. Here we go with all these acronyms again. The Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board, the Canadian Institute of Health Research. So all kinds of aspects were talked about that could be part of that Canadian drug agency. Will we ever get to the point where all of those groups, we do have this one single body plus Quebec to manage pharmaceuticals in Canada? I don't think so. However, I do think there's a wonderful opportunity to try and decrease some of that fragmentation that we have in the Canadian drug system.
I almost feel like it should be like a little bit of a drinking game. That every single time someone mentions an acronym, someone has to take a shot. Either that, or if they, whenever someone mentions, CADIF, but don't forget, there's also INES. I don't know how many times that's come up as well. So,
and then we can start talking about our international acronyms and some military acronyms, etc. So yeah, boy.
Now this is our curiosity, Brian, is you mentioned that you used to manage the military pharmaceutical health system. Is that different? Actually, I didn't even know that. Is that different than what we just talked about here? Is there another suite of acronyms that come with the military that's completely different than what we're talking about right now?
It absolutely is. If you are a member of the Canadian military, then the government of Canada is responsible for providing healthcare to you, just as they do for Indigenous peoples of Canada, for corrections. So the military does have its own healthcare system. But we do rely on the civilian healthcare system, our provincial healthcare system in many locations. We don't have major military hospitals anymore, but we do have clinics. We have physicians, nurses, pharmacists, lab techs, all kinds of health systems that we do support for members of the Canadian military. Absolutely.
Actually, so Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance initially was started by provinces and territories, and then they actually had Quebec join and also the federal drug program. So actually the federal drug programs, including NIHB and the corrections and so the military, like they actually do still sort of sit together to negotiate, and the negotiated prices do apply to the provincial, territorial, and federal drug programs across Canada.
Yeah, there essentially are 19 healthcare systems in Canada. Our 10 provinces, our 3 territories, and 6 federal programs.
Wow. I like the precision. It's like exactly 19. But I'm curious, actually, I want to pull on a thread that you had mentioned previously, Brian, in your explanation of we should not just talk about the CDA, but actually it's actually above that, like what does the Canadian government who represents Canadian people want from the pharmaceutical plan? And you had mentioned first dollar or fill the gap. And quite honestly, I don't actually know. Fill the gap, it's a little bit more straightforward to me. First dollar, I actually don't know what that even means. So if you can explain that, and maybe explain like how would those two different approaches change the way that the CDA or would work? Like how would that impact what the CDA does, or downstream from that?
Yeah, there's a major difference between universal public coverage, first dollar coverage by governments. In that type of a model, every Canadian citizen would be covered under that plan. So you go to a pharmacy, your drugs are covered under that federal plan. Versus in a fill the gap system, that would just expand our current system of both public coverage, the insurance companies that provide coverage to employees or individuals, as well as that large number of Canadians who have no drug coverage. For whatever reason, and that's probably 10 to 15% of our Canadian population that has to pay for their medication out of their pocket. And that's where we really need to fill the gap. So to fill the gap means to provide some form of coverage for those people who have no insurance or who don't have enough insurance, and there still is a significant financial risk. So those two systems are very different. We do have a lot of private insurance companies in Canada that provide coverage to unions, to government employees. There's probably 100,000 different plans that are provided through our private healthcare system, our private insurance.
So maybe I'll add to that too. Actually, maybe a good way to think about this too is, I don't know if you guys have heard about the Canada dental benefit that was recently, announced, right? So that's kind of like a fill a gap. Like I can't go to the dentist and use that plan, right? And so there's a very specific eligibility and everything. So, I mean, something else to think about, right, in terms of everyone being covered under one actual Canadian plan versus just filling a gap is, so if you're negotiating, a lot of times you negotiate a price of a drug, there's gonna be that volume component, right? So if there's a lot more population that you're negotiating for, then there is that the volume can sometimes drive better prices, right? So there is that type of difference as well, and that's why sometimes people say, well, if we had a national program, will we get better prices, for example? I'm not saying we will. There's a lot of nuances there, actually, but those are the kind of discussions that are different between fill a gap and everyone being covered under one plan.
And to bring it back to your question, what that means for a Canadian Drug Agency, certainly when I was at CADIF and all the discussion about national pharmacare and the Canadian Drug Agency and a separate PCPA body, all of these questions were out there in the role of PMPRB. I made it very clear to the politicians and the senior officials, both provincial and federal and territorial, that we will respond to whatever system you put in place. If you were to put in place a single payer system, we will respond to that and develop the appropriate services and programs and policies to meet and support your needs. If you want a fill the gap system, we will adapt and ensure that we deliver the support to all of the different stakeholders involved there. Likely, if it's a fill the gap system, there probably needs to be a closer relationship between the insurance companies and this Canadian Drug Agency.
Got it. No, thank you very much for that. So from my just rudimentary understanding, then Sangmi pointed out one thing is, depending on which one, that could impact negotiation. That makes a lot of sense. And then Sangmi also brought up this concept of eligibility. Like if you did fill the gap, then in some ways you have to determine like eligibility, and I assume that may fall under the remit of CDA. Like we're just making stuff up now, right? This is just all, we should have said this in the beginning. Disclosure: these are just opinions. These are not like we don't none of the guests nor ourselves know for a fact what will happen, but these are our opinions. And eligibility, you just assume that someone like the CDA would have to kind of manage what that means, and then also manage the relationships with the insurers. That's what you mean, though, by that, right, Brian?
Absolutely. Not just the insurers, but also with the other organizations that are involved in managing pharmaceuticals. The Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, ensuring it has what it needs to negotiate prices with pharmaceutical companies, with the PMPRB, with whoever is involved with managing pharmaceuticals in Canada. This Canadian Drug Agency will need to provide adequate support.
The other thing that I think of when we have the opportunity to shape a new technology assessment body, actually this will go beyond technology assessment realistically, is the sustainability of our programs. And we take a look recently with a lot of new technologies coming down the pipeline, whether it's immune therapies, whether it's things like CAR Ts, is really comparative to previous products, a substantial increase in the costs, but potentially huge payoffs in terms of their efficacy. It puts into question, how do you continue to fund these kinds of products, even with the promise that they bring to them? Is that the kind of thing that this sort of agency that we're talking about will have to address, or is that something we have to address regardless of whether we have a CDA in place or not?
Certainly, we have to address that regardless. I was just actually speaking in a conference about cell and gene therapies and the amazing promise and huge pipeline, but also just the difficulty in terms of implementing, right, and financing those types of therapies. So the nice thing about, again, like that data focus that is there with the CDA is that a lot of these really novel and very promising therapies are still coming to us with a lot of uncertainties. It seems curative. However, even CAR Ts, as you just mentioned, and again, for those folks who may not know what that is, it's basically you take out the T cells out of your body, you synthetically modify, put a sort of an antigen receptor that is actually going to bind. We're going to put it back into the patient's body. It's going to, kind of bind to those cancer cells and kill it, right? So, and then we actually have a technology now to basically, use viral vectors with the corrected gene or functional gene into a patient's body, and it's going to go and insert that particular genetic sequence into your body, or put it in so that it can actually make functional proteins or whatnot, right? So like those type of technologies here, but we don't really know exactly what the long-term side effects are going to be. Not everybody responds, not everybody is cured, so we really need to ensure that we have ability to monitor and really take down sort of that real world evidence of what is happening after we implement. And it has to be really a effort that is sort of standardized, and I think sort of across the country, and you'd be able to give you need to be able to provide with that expertise in terms of how to best collect that evidence and utilize it for decision making. So I think again, like we're going to have to do all of this, what you just said, anyways, in terms of working together and collaborating to figure out maybe a new way to budget and and sort of a different way to maybe negotiate and a different way to come together to ensure that we have the infrastructure to implement. But also, again, like that focus on real world evidence and data collection is going to be even more important with these new technologies.
Yeah, I do think, and let me just reflect upon the current leadership at CADTH and in the future, the Canadian Drug Agency under Suzanne McGurn with Sudha Cuddy and Brent Fraser, Nicole Mittman, Heather Logan, great leadership team. And they are looking at what is happening, not just in Canada, but globally. What is happening in this field of pharmaceutical management in Europe, in the United States with the Inflation Reduction Act. In Europe, it's the Health Technology Assessment Regulation, Asia Pacific, Latin America. So there's all kinds of things that we need to be aware of, and what would be the impact of some of these programs on pharmaceutical management in Canada. I've said for years that we are starting to see significant pressure on our ability to manage the pharmaceutical programs in not just in Canada, but globally. I mean, we're seeing fantastic innovation coming out of universities and companies. We're seeing patients and clinicians demanding early and equitable access to these types of drugs and technologies. We're seeing the regulators, Health Canada, the Food and Drug Administration, European Medicines Agency, all around the world, accelerating the approval of these promising pharmaceuticals with so much uncertainty from a payer perspective and a patient and clinician perspective. And then it's the affordability question. So all of these things are hitting us in the face. We do need to continue to evolve our processes. We're probably going to start talking a little bit more about more innovative contracting methods, and all of this aspect of getting early access to patients is going to require different ways of thinking. And as Sang-Mi said, different data to help us understand whether these products provide good value to patients and to taxpayers.
Thanks, Brian. You mentioned actually multiple times in this conversation, we've mentioned this concept of health technology assessment. But just for folks, just in case people aren't familiar with what that means, Brian, could you maybe give the simplest answer you possibly could think of? I know it's an incredibly long process and it's very, very technical, but if you could go give us, what does it mean what does health technology assessment, what does that mean?
It's very cool, because one of the things I used to talk about with new employees at Cadith is when you're talking to your loved ones, your friends, your family about what you do, how do you explain it to them? So I asked them all to try and come up with the elevator speech of what health technology assessment is all about. You meet somebody in an elevator, you got 10 floors to try and say what you do without them falling asleep. So Sang-Mi's talked a little bit about the regulators. So the regulators are extremely important because they provide the marketing authorization. They tell companies whether or not their product can be sold. And they do that through looking at the benefits of that product against a placebo and the harms or the risk. So it's a benefit risk assessment. If there's more benefits than there are risks, that product likely will get an approval from the regulator. But it doesn't tell anybody about the value that that provides to both patients and taxpayers. It doesn't say how much better it is. So that's where health technology assessment comes in. We look at new drugs and existing drugs with new indications, as well as medical devices and diagnostic tests and all kinds of public health aspects. But if we talk about pharmaceuticals, we're looking at comparing that new drug or new indication for the drug against the current standard of practice, the current drugs that are being used to treat whatever condition that is. And we do that by looking at it clinically. We compare it clinically. We compare the harms associated with it versus the current therapies. And we look at the value it provides using this cost effectiveness modeling that we do. And then there's a whole bunch of other things that we also want to incorporate into that recommendation that comes out of the HTA body. We ensure that we engage stakeholders, patients and patient groups, clinicians and clinical groups, industry themselves, the innovators. We look at ethics, we look at policies, all kinds of factors associated with it. But it really is about the comparative effectiveness and comparative cost effectiveness of that new drug or new indication for the drug.
Great elevator pitch. I wouldn't have fallen asleep. That was awesome. So that's great. But no, to Sang-Mi's point, actually, Sang-Mi, if you could maybe, you point out CAR T, and thank you for explaining what that even means. So that's perfect. Like, give an example of what would be an issue that currently is challenging to address with the current framework that is in place from let's say a market access perspective, and then what needs to evolve as an example, just so that to contextualize the example why that is challenging for the current system.
Yeah, so CAR T is again example of a cell and gene therapy. And really what you're sort of looking at is a very high cost one-time treatment instead of sort of a more chronic over time treatment that may potentially deal with the symptoms. So CAR T is supposed to cure, right, some types of cancer. It does mean that it is much more expensive, let's say, than a chemotherapy would cost over a year or 2 years or whatnot, right? And with this particular therapy too, it actually kind of needs to be provided in a hospital. You need to potentially have an inpatient bed available. And there's some other cell and gene therapies that are coming that is basically like a stem cell transplant. You actually need a transplant bed, right? In the beginning, actually, Brian remembers this. When the first CAR Ts came, we weren't exactly even sure if, like, is this really a drug or is it a procedure, right? And actually, right now, CAR Ts are implemented in a way that is like a procedure where patients from small provinces who may not have access can actually go to, say, Ontario through interprovincial transfers. And that's not something that happens with just a drug therapy that's given, right? So again, like in terms of what I would say, it's not necessarily sort of, an issue because of the way CAR-T is, but in general, right now, there isn't a really good understanding of this type of new, therapies in terms of where the budget is going to come from, and exactly how the implementation process would look like. Let's say, is it only going to be in one province? Is it going to be in multiple provinces? We are really not sure, right, as to how to make that one-time curative treatment more affordable, because you can't just borrow money from what a patient would have used as a treatment for 50 years and say, okay, well, because they would have spent $5 million or over 50 years, we can actually pay $5 million today. Like, everybody would love to buy a house instead of renting. That makes more sense financially, but that doesn't mean that they have that upfront money, right? So like it's these type of things that are really difficult to sort of sort through, especially when you have multiple really new technologies that are coming where you haven't implemented them before and you don't really know exactly, again, like I said, which budget, which institutions, which do we have enough expertise, what's the patient sort of journey look like we just don't have answers to all of that. So we just need everybody to come together and kind of discuss how will we prepare for this sort of influx of cell and gene therapies.
Yeah, so saying me probably some really interesting and important points here. From my perspective as well, I think health equity needs to be part of this conversation. Canada is an enormous country, and we have people living in rural and remote areas that won't have easy access to some of these new therapies, and we need to figure that out somehow, some way. These therapies might not be available even in every province and territory. So again, implementation, going beyond the price negotiation and the health technology assessment, is crucial. How do we implement these new therapies in an equitable way, in an efficient way, so that all Canadians can benefit from this type of innovation?
Great. No, I'm glad you brought that up, because obviously that not only is it a hot topic, but it is just as Canadians, it's what's fair, right, Brian? And I completely agree with you on that front. In going back to what Sang-Mi was talking about in terms of price and then the budget, in some ways, say this drug or this actually procedure. Now you confuse me too. Actually, I'm like, actually, is it a drug? Is it a procedure? Right? That's interesting. Actually, conceptually, it actually is very interesting. Say it does save someone. In some ways, it's like you're putting a price on a human life. Like, how do you even do that? That seems yeah, how do you even model that? Is there a special model you click on? It's like, I'm even thinking, is it something, if this person lives an extra 50 years, do they have to like contribute, I don't know, 10% of their income to pay for this or something? Yeah, I don't know. It is kind of interesting you bring that up, actually.
That's why we have HTA and we have cost effectiveness analysis, and that's why we have health economics, because you want to put some methodological sort of rigor there in terms of thinking about, as what Brian was saying, is the drug sort of worth paying for? How much should we pay for it? And what is the additional value it's bringing? And that's why not every drug that's approved through Health Canada is funded by you. Even even private payers don't fund every single drug.
The cost effectiveness analysis that I mentioned, as Sang-Mi said, we have health economists, people that are trained in modeling and economics itself, that help us put that together. But it's not the only thing that we use. So we come out with a metric called the cost per quality adjusted life year, the cost per quality, and that helps us compare a new drug versus a new surgical procedure versus a new diagnostic test on an even playing field. And these health economists do wonderful work in helping us do those types of comparisons. But we look at many other factors associated with that new drug or that new procedure or that new device before a decision is made and before it actually gets into the hands of clinicians and patients.
This harkens me back to my days of health economics and trying to sort of really understand how do you implement some of these sort of trade-offs between different interventions or even different patient groups? So cancer versus a pediatric indication or something that happens end of life. I mean, these are seem to always be just drastically different, but someone needs to actually have them all in front of them and make that tough decision of where do you allocate those resources, because they are finite. They're, we can't do everything all at once. But the one thing I do recall from my training, a lot of this was done as a point in time decision, right? So you create a model, it's assessed through an HTA, and a decision is made. And typically, unless there is some sort of catastrophic side effect that is identified as the intervention goes to a larger population, that just basically stays as is until something new comes along to replace it. But I think that sort of static approach to access to new therapies and to the reimbursement of new therapies may now start, maybe it's starting to be displaced with this sort of dynamic view of how do you manage a formulary to ensure that you always have the optimal sort of combination of interventions. Is that something that we should be looking forward to, or that we would expect to sort of displace the traditional approach to market access decision making?
I think for sure that is definitely where we are trying to go, and I'm sure Brian can comment on like life cycle HTA. And there's a lot that is happening, right? As again, CADIT has already been evolving into sort of thinking about time limited recommendations, where you kind of issue a recommendation, but then you're going to go back and look at the sort of bigger trial data later to sort of say, okay, does our recommendation still stand, or what is sort of more detailed analysis on potential cost effectiveness based on more data. I having actually worked at the provincial drug programs too, even after something is funded, we did a lot of work to look at whether, was it being used appropriately? Should we change maybe the funding criteria or how it's listed? And, the price of a drug is one thing, but, as we've all been hearing about Ozempic, for example, let's say. And so it's like, well, uh, there's price and then there's volume, right? And so sometimes if you can really limit the drug use to really the right population, or sort of let's say limited subgroup or whatnot, then it's possible that you can pay a bit higher price. Maybe it is more cost effective in those populations. And then if you have a situation where you have extremely high utilization, where I don't know that a lot of them, a lot of patients are potentially using it sort of in the best way possible, the cost could be dramatic and the budget impact could be dramatic, right? And so definitely looking at how a drug is being utilized in the real world, and and potentially sort of being able to be more agile about pricing and agreements and thresholds, all of that is going to have a big impact on how you manage sustainability of a drug budget.
And not to put words in your mouth, but that takes data, right? That takes like real time, real world data at your fingertips, and to be able to do that in an easy way.
Yeah, and Costas, I think we have moved both in the regulatory science as well as in the HTA. We've moved from that point in time decision to more of what they refer to as a rolling review or a life cycle assessment of the product. And to do that, certainly we have to have data across the life cycle. We do need to make a decision when that product is sent to an HTA body or to a regulator. A decision or a recommendation does need to be made at that point in time based on whatever evidence we have. I know for a fact that if we received a new drug application today based on the evidence that we used to think we needed to make these decisions, we'd be saying no to a lot of these new drugs just because of the accelerated pathways, the lack of evidence, the uncertainty, both in the value as well as the clinical and safety aspects of that new drug. So that's why we have adopted this life cycle approach to HTA. I co-led an international task force to develop a new definition for health technology assessment in around 2018, and we did publish that new definition. And it had to be multidisciplinary, it had to be scientific, it needed to assess the value of a technology across that life cycle, and it needed to inform policy or decision making. So all of these factors come into play, and that just demonstrates the value of that post-market evidence, whether that's real-world evidence, whatever it happens to be.
Yeah.
No, I think that's that's the other trigger word. That is another drinking game. It's a time limited recommendation. That's like something special to Costa somehow managed to bring that up on every single conversation we have. So that's definitely something he's super keenly interested in talking about. But I know we took up a lot of your time already. We don't want to take up more of your time. You've been very generous with it, and our producer always tells us you got to make sure that we keep it within an hour. So apologies, because this has been a fascinating conversation with both Sang-Mi and Brian. So maybe just to end things off, Brian's brought up health equity as something that's incredibly important that we need to look into, or needs to be part of the conversation. So maybe the closing question is, with the formation of new CDA, what's the one thing you hope it can help with in terms of improving health equity? Maybe we'll start with Sang-Mi, and then we'll end with Brian.
Thanks. Yeah, so for me, I think the fact that we're trying to, through CDA, sort of better capture the data, that actually means also trying to better capture the data of those subpopulations or the populations that we really don't generally ensure that, like we are sort of making sort of well-informed decisions about. So I want to, I would really hope that CDA is going to help, gather the right data across the whole Canadian population, right, with a focus around that equity as well, and so that we can make the best decisions for all Canadians.
I'm going to just start by talking a little bit about the organization that you mentioned I'm president of, which is ISPOR, International Society for Health Economics and Outcomes Research. The P in there is about pharmacoeconomics, but we've basically it's about health economics and outcomes research. And annually, or actually, I guess it's about every 2 years, we put out a top 10 trends list. And we've just released our top 10 trends for 2024, 2025. Number one is real world evidence, by the way. And within that, number 5 is health equity. Health equity is crucial. And my role as president, I'm the board chair for ISPOR. It's an unpaid role. And we've made it very clear in our board discussions that we need to embed health equity in everything we do in ISPOR. And I think that's exactly what Suzanne and the team at CADITH will do as well, is ensure that it's not an afterthought, it's not just an add-on, it's embedded in our thinking that we do have to consider the rural and remote areas of Canada. We have to focus in on marginalized and racialized populations. There's a great opportunity and a great responsibility for all of those who work at the Canadian Drug Agency to ensure that we focus in on health equity.
Great. That's beautiful. Thank you very much, both of you, for joining us today and having an awesome conversation. If you like this conversation, please subscribe to the channel, What's with RW. Again, thank you very much to our guests, Brian and Sang-Mi, for joining us and having this conversation, discussion. And feel free to, again, subscribe. Thank you very much and have a wonderful rest of your day.